The Gearhead Woodshop. Today, I'm building the ultimate workbench for my home shop, and it costs me less than $200. The first step in any project is careful planning. I like to scribble some notes on a piece of paper before I inevitably measure once and cut twice. That's how you're supposed to do it, right? Once I like my plan, I can make my measurements, and then my cuts. I want this bench to be 36 inches tall, so I subtract a ½ inch for the top and cut 3 legs to 35.5 inches. The fourth leg is cut to 23 5/8. The shorter leg is the side my table saw will sit on, so I subtracted the 11 3/4 inch height of the saw, minus a ½ inch for the shelf it will sit on, then added an 1/8 of an inch so the deck will sit just slightly above the bench top. This should allow larger pieces of wood to slide seamlessly from the table saw to the bench top. After cutting all the pieces, I laid them out how they would be assembled so I could start putting the legs and lower shelf together. If I already had a workbench, I would build the box for the shelf first, then attach the legs, but since I'm working on the ground, I'm going to lay the legs flat and attach the 2x4s this way. I want the lower shelf to be 9.5 inches off the ground, so I subtract the 4-inch thickness of the shelf and mark where the bottom will sit on the 2x4 leg. Then I use 2.5 inch screws to attach them. With the sides assembled, I cut a scrap piece of wood 5.5 inches tall to hold the 2x4 support close to where I want it while I connect the two sides. If you're thinking there's no way that frame is going to be square, you're probably right. But when I drop the 4x8 plywood on, that should square things up nicely. An easy way to check for square is to measure diagonally from corner to corner. If these numbers are different, then it's not square. Somehow, this one's actually pretty close. At this point, I decided to flip the frame over and install the casters so I can wheel this thing around while I finish it. I got this set of 4 retractable casters for like $35 on Amazon. I really like these because I can set the table down while I'm working and it won't move. Then I can drop the wheels and roll it away until the next project. The kit came with a template to mark the holes for the brackets. I marked all 4 legs, then pre-drilled 6 holes in each leg. Then I forgot the frame was upside down and almost put this on backwards. To install these brackets, you need a long Phillips head bit. A magnetic one would have been a good choice because you can't really hold the screw and the bracket out of the way at the same time, but eventually I got them all in. With the brackets installed, it was time to put the wheels on. The kit came with this thin, 2-sided wrench that fit nicely between the 2 plates where the top nut was, but it was the wrong size. So I did my best to just hold the top plate with my hand and tighten the bottom nut with the wrench. It's got a lock nut and I'm not going to be rolling very fast or very far, so it should be fine. Also, this thing weighs a ton, so I don't imagine the wheels will fall off even if the nut loosens up. After installing the wheels, I flipped it over so I could roll it around and test them out. If I could do this over again, I might put the posts a little bit closer to the ground because even though it's only 3/4 of an inch, this thing falls pretty hard when I drop it down. I used 1/2 inch plywood for the lower shelf. Using the frame and some scrap 2x4, I marked the holes for the legs so I can cut them out with a jigsaw. That way there won't be any cut lines and the plywood will sit perfectly on top of the 4x8 frame. Then I tried to drag the plywood up onto the frame. Remember when I got the retractable casters so this thing wouldn't roll around on me while I'm trying to work? I drilled some 3/4 inch holes to start my jigsaw cuts, and after a quick inspection from my helper, I was ready to cut some holes. Or rectangles, I guess. Believe it or not, this is not my first time using a jigsaw. If you're planning a similar project, it's never a good idea to put your hand in front of the blade like this. I was trying to hold the material still while I cut, but using a clamp would have been a much smarter idea. If you've ever used a jigsaw, you've probably dealt with dust covering your lines, so you can't really see where you're supposed to cut. Unfortunately, I don't have a jigsaw with a vacuum port, so I tried taping a vacuum to the board to suck up the dust. That didn't really work, so I just gave up and went for it on the next 3. After cutting each hole, I gave it a quick test with my scrap 2x4 to make sure it was the right size. Then it was time to see if I measured and cut everything correctly. A little finagling, and it actually dropped right on. Then I threw a couple screws in and I was ready to start working on the top. I flipped the table saw upside down and placed it on the bottom side of the top so the cutout would be exactly where I want it, on the right corner of the workbench. Then I traced the outline and carefully cut it out with the jigsaw. Again, amazed that I still have all my fingers. Now I can install the front and side supports and measure off the top so I know exactly where to finish building the structure for the table saw. Once again, I drilled and cut the holes in the lower shelf for the support legs. Then I flipped the table on its side and installed some more supports for the lower platform. Now I can finally finish securing the plywood to the base. I marked holes about every 12 inches, pre-drilled, and then used a countersink bit to prevent things from catching on the screw heads when sliding them on and off the shelf. After installing the legs, I put the top on to check the fit, then finished the upper frame and secured the top. I put screws evenly spaced to satisfy my OCD and used a countersink bit to ensure a perfectly flat work area. I used the piece I cut out for the table saw to build the shelf for it. I traced the oddly shaped base as best I could, attempting to make it stick out about a 1/4 inch from the saw. After cutting it out, I made sure the height was correct, and then secured the shelf. With the basic structure complete, I used a 1/16 inch roundover bit on my router to clean up the edges and gave the whole thing a quick sanding to make it look pretty and hopefully avoid getting too many splinters. Now when I say quick sanding, I mean it took forever. I hate sanding. Maybe I'm better off with rough edges and splinters. Still sanding. Still sanding. Okay, now I'm done. And this is where I ran into my first problem. That turned out not to be a problem. Let me explain. I planned on using a bucket like this to collect the dust from the table saw, and while I measured the height perfectly, I didn't quite get the width right. I have these 2x4 braces holding the shelf on, and it just hits this wider part of the bucket that holds the handle. So I think if I rip about 1 inch off one of those 2x4s, that should give me the clearance I need to slide the bucket under, and dust collection should be solved. So I marked and cut the 2x4s and made the bucket fit, and decided to go in a totally different direction. My original plan was to take this 5-gallon bucket, slide it under the saw, and use that for dust collection. But while I was cleaning up the other day, I had a better idea. I'm going to try to take this 2.5 inch elbow, cut this piece off, slide this donut over, and then take my shop vac, which is 2 1/4 inch hose, slides into this 2-inch donut, drill a hole, slide that under, and see if that will suck up the dust a little better than falling into the bucket. So I made this not at all sketchy cut on my miter saw, cut out the hole with my jigsaw, did a little test fit, and tried it out. It works pretty okay. The last piece of the puzzle is the router table. I was going to build my own, but then I found this one on Amazon for like $30. I think if I recess it into the top, this will be the ideal setup for cutting rabbits and dados and stuff like that. I immediately ran into a problem when I tried to attach my Ryobi palm router to the table. Apparently the bolt pattern is not a standard size, so after drilling and countersinking a couple new holes, I got the router bolted to the table and could get to work fitting the table to the workbench. I used my square and a 2x4 spacer to place and mark where I wanted the table to sit. I wanted to make sure I had room for the router under the bench top and enough surface area to accommodate larger projects. Now I have to cut a hole for the router, but leave enough material to hold the table, and also cut it out perfectly so the table sits flush to just a hair above the bench top. Piece of cake. After cutting the hole, I set my router depth to just short of the table height, and as carefully as I could, I started working on the recess. I used a guide and really took my time because I need this to fit perfectly. Not only will it look better, it needs to fit snugly so it won't move when I'm using it, but also not too tight that I can't remove it when necessary. Overall, I'm really happy with how this cutout turned out. The table fits in nice and snug. All the gaps look pretty good. Right here, router got away from me a little bit. I don't love that, but it's about 1/16 off. Otherwise, everything else looks good. Top of the table is slightly proud of the tabletop, so that way when I'm working, nothing's going to get caught as I slide over. I did leave the edges a little bit wide. My thought was that if I needed to bolt it down, if it wasn't super tight, if it was moving around, I could bolt it down. The only issue with that is these little grooves here. I have to fit these carriage bolts under here, and if I do that, it's not going to slide. So I'm going to have to cut this out. So I marked it. I marked those two slots. I'm going to have to fit that bolt through there. So I'm going to have to make that slightly wider. I'm not sure how I'm going to cut that yet. I think I'm going to try it with the router, although I don't think I have a bit as big as those bolt heads. So I will have to play with that a little bit. After messing around for a while, I decided to just give it a shot with the router bit that I had. Once again, I really took my time and did several test fits to get it just right. And eventually, I got it. The table sits flush and the fence slides exactly the way I wanted. Then I bolted the router to the table, gave it one final test fit, and tried it out on a scrap piece of wood. The last thing I need is a channel for the miter gauge. So I drew some lines and cut out a channel. Now it works great, and I think I'm done with the workbench. It wasn't until I went to use it for the first time that I realized that's not right. As you've probably noticed, I put the router table in backwards. You should always feed it from the right side, meaning the fence should be on your right. I was so focused on having more table space for larger pieces like cabinets, I completely forgot which direction you're supposed to feed from. This was wrong, it doesn't work very well this way, and it's kind of dangerous, so I flipped it around. I repeated all the work I had just done, cutting a channel for the miter gauge and slots for the carriage bolts to slide. Then ran into my next problem. The main reason I wanted this router table was to make things like rabbets, dados, and tongue and groove joints. Well, the fence is too small for the tongue and groove bits to work properly, so I cut a hole in a 2x4 and clamped it to the fence. It works surprisingly okay, but I don't think I'm going to use it. I'm just going to stick with making these joints on my table saw until I get a real router table. At this point, I thought I was ready to use my new setup. I went to make my first cut and realized I have another problem. When I cut this perfectly to fit the table saw, I did not account for sliding the fence all the way over. So I marked where it was hitting, gave it some clearance, and now it's ready to go. Overall, I'm really happy with this setup for my shop. I finally have a large flat area to work. I love the way the router and the table saw setup works for the type of projects that I do. And being able to easily move it around and then lock it down when I don't want it to move is awesome. I can't recommend those retractable casters enough. I also have tons of space underneath to add tool storage and organization. So you can look for that update in a future video. If I could do this over again, I wouldn't really change anything. I probably wouldn't waste so much time on the bucket method of dust collection, but otherwise, it's a pretty simple design that just works and has the potential for other improvements as I continue to work with it. At some point, I definitely want to upgrade my table saw and get a real router table, but this works with what I have. I'm just happy I'm not working on the ground or on plastic folding tables anymore. In total, I spent $198, and for that money, I think this really is the ultimate workbench for my basement shop. Until next time, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, consider subscribing, and good luck to you on your next project.